It's my pleasure. It's fallen to me the honor of introducing Miss Applebaum to this distinguished crowd. I was thrilled when Anne accepted our invitation to come to Calgary just as her new book, Iron Curtain, was published to critical acclaim in the English-speaking world. You know, for the better part of the second half of the 20th century, I think all of us in this room thought a lot about Europe, about Eastern Europe in particular, and about Russia for one simple reason, the Cold War. Now, almost 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I would say almost a quarter of a century of studied indifference on the part of Americans regarding Europe, our attention once again is focused on the continent across the Atlantic. And this is primarily because of the Eurozone crisis. But tonight, I think we have an important opportunity to broaden our understanding of a fast-changing Europe. And we do so with the analysis and the insights of one of Europe's most versatile English-language thinkers and historians. As I mentioned earlier, she has won the Pulitzer Prize for her 2004 book on Russia, Gulag, A History. I would put it in my top 10 all-time nonfiction books. It is a superb history of the Soviet Union. If you haven't read it, read it. And she's just out, as I mentioned, with a big new book on the post-war history of Eastern Europe, Iron Curtain. All of you will be provided with a copy of this work tonight. She writes a widely followed column in the Washington Post, and as the better half of one of the fastest rising political stars in Europe, Poland's foreign minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, she's had a front row seat these past 3 years to the Eurozone crisis and its impact on the continent's power politics. I've asked Anne to share her insights tonight from her latest book, The Key Insights of Iron Curtain, and what they tell us about the future power shifts in Europe between its traditional great powers, its European periphery, and the increasingly Byzantine Russia of Vladimir Putin. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for one of contemporary Europe's great women of letters, Anne Applebaum.
Thank you. I've always wanted to be a woman of letters, so now I guess I've achieved that. Thank you very much for such a warm welcome in your wonderfully cold city. I have to say I walked a little bit around Calgary today, and I'm delighted to say that it proves to me now, I believe it, that it's possible to have oil and gas in close proximity and not be a corrupt and unpleasant dictatorship. So congratulations on figuring out how to manage your natural resources and stay decent and build this nice city. And thank you very, very much for having me here tonight. I appreciate it a lot. I am going to talk, as Rudyard said, a little bit, just a tiny flavor of my new book. The idea for this book came out of my previous book. My previous book was a history of the Gulag, which was the Soviet concentration camp system. And this book was inspired by my growing fascination with the question of why people go along with nasty regimes. So when you have a corrupt dictatorship or when you have a totalitarian regime, why do people collaborate? Why do they go along with it? And the book talks about the period right after the Second World War when the Soviet Union, with the Red Army and the NKVD, which was the name of the Soviet secret police, came into Eastern Europe and set up new institutions of control. And what I wanted to know is, what were those institutions? What did they do first? How did they build this new system? And I won't describe to you the entire premise of the book. I'll just mention a few things that were surprising to me, or might be surprising to those of you who don't know this piece of history, about what was done first. So the first thing that Russians did when they arrived, they did not nationalize everything. On the contrary, the very first thing they did was they had created in advance small secret police forces. They brought them into the country immediately, and they immediately began using not mass violence, not sort of random killing, but very carefully targeted violence. And they were targeting specific kinds of people, so former politicians and former policemen and former businessmen, and priests, intellectuals. And what they were looking for was anybody who had an ability to organize the society, anybody who might be a leader. What interested them were potential enemies. So not just people who'd done something to the Soviet system, but people who could possibly be enemies in the future. One of the second things, and another more surprising thing they did, was the first people who interested them in the first groups that they began to repress were not necessarily other politicians. They left that for a little bit later. It was institutions of what we now call civil society. So the Boy Scouts, Catholic youth groups, women's groups. Again, organizations, spontaneous organizations, people who were able to organize from the ground up. They put pressure on right away. In East Germany, in Berlin, I should say, not East Germany. In Berlin, right after the war, there were groups of young people who, in this terrible rubble from the terrible destruction of the war, immediately began to form youth groups, rebuild things, clear the rubble. And one of the first things the East German communists did under Soviet advice was get rid of them. We can't have these independent groups. Everybody needs to be a member of the communist youth group. And so that's done really before almost anything else. They're interested in those kinds of organizations. The third thing that is perhaps surprising is they were very interested in the radio. So newspapers can exist, that's fine, some independent magazines, but control over what they thought was mass media, the medium that would reach the peasants and the workers, that's something they had to have right away. Why? Because this was a regime that believed very much in the power of its own propaganda and the efficacy of its own propaganda. If we just explain it to everybody in the right way, they will understand it and they will follow it. Marx has said that history is going to unfold in this way, and therefore it will happen exactly as we have said. In due course, then there was the partial and in some cases total nationalization of industry followed, eventually the elimination of politicians, of other kinds of political parties. And what was left actually within an extremely short period of time, by about 1950, you had societies in which not only the political sphere and not only the economic sphere, but social life, artistic life, cultural life, civic life is all under the control of the state. And this was a system that it had already been created in the Soviet Union, which created enormous personal dilemmas for people. And I ask you to sympathize with the man who, in the city of Dresden, owns a printing press. And in 1947, before they've been nationalized, he's told that this printing press, that there's a law is passed that says everybody who owns a printing press is only allowed to print whatever the central planners have dictated they can print. He lives in Dresden. He owns a printing press. A few months ago, his cousin disappeared. His cousin was a priest or a pastor and has been taken away. Nobody knows what's happened to him. His wife is ill and needs some kind of special medicine, which of course she can only get at the state hospital. He has 2 teenage sons whom he very much wants them to study at university. How likely is someone in that position to say, okay, I'm going to break the law, I'm going to print something not ordered by the state central planning commission? I mean, he doesn't feel a great deal of guilt about that. I mean, how terrible is that? He's just following the law. And then when somebody says, and will you print the collected works of Stalin? Of course he will. I mean, why not? If he doesn't do it, somebody else will. And what happens then in the society, and you see this pattern developing in the 40s, is all over the society at this period of time. All the other printing press owners are making the same set of decisions, and within 5 or 6 years, there's nothing to read except the collected works of Stalin and other related things. And this is done by people who aren't necessarily ideological, and they don't necessarily believe in every word. Maybe they believe in some of it, or they would like to believe in that things are going to be made better by this new system, but they are given such few choices that they find they have no choice but but to go along with things. I'm talking about this is the system as it was created between 1945 and 1950, and I describe that in the book in a lot more detail than I'm giving you here tonight. I was able to work in archives while writing this book. They're all open. I was also able to meet people who were young people usually at the time, but who were able to tell stories. And the book tells a lot of stories, and it examines these kinds of choices and moral choices that people had to make at the time, and tries to look a little bit at the psychology of people living in that moment. And what when I write a history book like this, sometimes people ask me, well, what are the lessons for the present? There are lessons and there aren't lessons, but what the book does do, I think, is it gives you the backdrop to other events. History people's lives never begin from scratch. People come from something. They have had a set of experiences. And the people who run Russia now, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, was age 15 when he first tried to join the KGB and work for it. And this was a period when the KGB was run by someone called Yuri Andropov, who later became General Secretary of the Communist Party. And Andropov was very experienced in the politics of Eastern Europe, exactly in this period that I've described, and happens to have been the Soviet ambassador to Budapest in 1956. And that meant that Andropov had seen this system imposed, and he'd also watched it unravel. And how did it unravel? Well, the Hungarian Revolution, I just talk about that a little bit in the book, unraveled precisely because these little groups in civil society, the sort of intellectual discussion groups and journalists who work for small newspapers, began to be, after Stalin's death, they were given a little bit more air, a little bit more freedom. They began talking openly. They began speaking openly about Hungary's problems and what was wrong with it. And what happened, and as Andropov would have seen it, this mushroomed. The little groups turned into bigger groups. The bigger groups turned into a rebellion, which eventually, when the army joined it, became an armed revolution against Soviet power. And one of the side effects of that armed revolution was that quite a lot of secret policemen were lynched. Andropov saw this. Another person, and Putin was educated in Andropov's KGB, but Putin himself had a similar experience. He was in East Germany in 1989. He was in Dresden. Where he also watched what happened when you allow people a little bit of air. You allow again, these petty democracy groups. Nobody thought that in East Germany there was a movement or a political organization strong enough to defy the communist system. And after all, in East Germany, all the real dissidents had been leaving the country pretty regularly. It was possible to get out of. Until 1961, you could walk over the border till the wall was built. And even after that, people found ways. There were swaps with the West Germans eventually bought dissidents. They would pay East Germany hard currency. So many people had been leaving. Nobody really thought much of the ability of East Germans to organize themselves. But guess what? It did turn out in the summer and autumn of 1989 that people were capable of organizing themselves again. And once they ceased to be afraid, once that awareness of how violence could be used melted away, then they began to organize again. Putin witnessed this. He witnessed the sacking of the Stasi building. He saw what happened when you let these little Democrats begin to have more of a voice. So Putin, in his control of Russia today, I would say, is not a Stalinist dictator, and he has not brought back the Soviet Union. His method of managing Russia is not totalitarian. He doesn't try to control everything. Instead, that he uses a kind of it's been described as managed democracy and corporate capitalism. So in today's Russia, you can say whatever you want as long as not that many people are listening. You can write whatever you want in a small newspaper as long as not that many people are going to read it. It's cleverer than, it doesn't try to control everything and make everybody go along with everything all the time. He also makes use of very old KGB tactic, targeted violence. You don't have to kill all the journalists, but if you kill one or two of them, and if you kill somebody like Anna Politkovskaya, she was a famous journalist killed a few years ago in the stairwell of her Moscow apartment, probably because she knew too much about the Chechen war and corruption around that. If you kill her, then you make all the other journalists very scared. The same is true of businessmen. You don't have to intimidate every rich oligarch in Russia, but if you lock one or two of them up, as many of you will know the story of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, your brother in the oil business in Russia, who's now in prison. If you lock up one or two of them, then you scare everybody else as well. So he understood this tactic very well. What else does he do? Well, the radio is no longer the most important mass medium, but television is. And so the way the media works now in Russia is that television is under state control. Other things, as I say, there's some freedom of the press in small newspapers. There's room for economic debate and so on in some other parts of the written press. But the mass press, the mass television, that's under very close and tight control, just as it would have been in Eastern Europe. That's the medium that the state wants to use to communicate what it thinks. The third thing Putin does, and this is, if you look at it objectively, it doesn't make sense. Enormous amount of pressure, once again, put on what we now call civil society. In Russia, they usually get called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And they range from, some of them are human rights groups, but a lot of them are environmental groups, or they are very small, they're very small charities. They don't look to the naked eye like threats to the Kremlin and its multi-billion-dollar budget and its military power. So why does he spend so much time? Why is there so much energy expended on repressing them? And there are laws passed designed to harass them. He mentions them frequently. He actually, in his acceptance speech after his most recent re-election, again, that's another piece of the story. There is democracy in Russia, but it's manipulated democracy. There are elections, but we know who's going to win them. But in the acceptance speech after he won, he launched out a sort of attack on the groups that are trying to undermine me, and the foreigners who want to undermine the state in Russia. And what he meant was, the small environmental groups who want to know how much nuclear waste is being dumped into the Baltic Sea. What's that about? He's said in so many words, and others have surmised. He has a kind of paranoia about the rise of these kinds of groups, that the next revolution could come from within civil society, just from where you don't expect it. And he's interested in cutting it off before it happens. And people often say, there is one big difference, though, between the way Putin rules Russia and the way his Soviet predecessors ruled Russia, which is that he doesn't adhere to or even talk about Marxist ideology. And I have to agree that's true. He doesn't speak about Marxism. But there is a kind of rhetoric that he uses to legitimate his regime, and he does have an argument for why he should be in power. And it goes something like this: I'm a modernizer. Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe. The 1990s were chaos. The economy collapsed. Russia was about to be carved up by foreign oil companies. I came to power. I'm a modernizer. And I'm a guarantee that your state wages will be paid. And Russia is still a country where many millions of people are dependent on the state directly for their wages and not indirectly, as Mitt Romney explained in America, where people are directly dependent on the state for their wages. I'm your guarantor that they're going to be paid. And the implication is, if you leave me in power, living standards will slowly rise. There will be no chaos. He has had an immense amount of luck in the last decade. You all here know what the luck comes from. He's had very high oil prices. And in a state where it's very difficult to collect taxes, where other sources of revenue are suspect and unreliable, one way or another, high oil and gas prices have kept the Russian budget from being in deficit and have enabled him to expand social spending in order to keep that minimum level of security for people, and that is what people expect from him further. You can see where that's going. I looked it up. We were talking about this afternoon, which is at what level does the oil price have to be to keep the Russian budget balanced? There's a different argument now. It's something between $113 and $117 a barrel. And even last summer at $100 a barrel, right. So, you all probably know what the spot price was 10 minutes ago, but even at $100 a barrel, they will be 100 billion rubles a year in shortfall. And if it falls to 80, 70, 60, $50 a barrel, then the state could be in a real crisis. So this is now what's in the back of his head. This could be the piece of the puzzle that challenges Putin in the next 3 or 4 years. You hear Russia is still a place. One of the oddities of it is because you still don't have a reliable press. Moscow is a city awash with rumors. Coincidentally, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've seen 2 friends of mine, both very different, but both Russians, who I ran into in Washington and New York. And both of them gave me completely different assessments of what was going on. Ooh, Putin's about to go. It's a matter of days or weeks. And the other one said, no, they're going to be there forever. It's never going to end. I mean, there's a real lack of reliable news. It's even one of those societies where suspicion and rumor can take on such proportions that the government occasionally feels the need to intervene. And there's been so much hysteria. I don't know how many of you know that the world is going to end in December because of the Mayan calendar. Everybody's nodding. The world's going to end in December. This rumor and this story has taken on so much force and power in Russia that there was the environmental minister, I think it was, had to get up in front of the television and say he's studied carefully the processes of, studied the earth and geology and so on. The world is not going to end in December. It's all fine. That was a public announcement that had to be made. But that tells you that there's something underlying the surface in Russia. There's a distrust in the written word. There's distrust in what people say, and there's a willingness to believe in superstition and rumor. Where does this story leave Eastern Europe? As Rudyard said, I spend a lot of my time, about half my time at the moment, in Poland, and I have deep personal insights into the workings of the Polish government. One of the questions somebody asked me a couple of days ago was, in the wake of the Euro crisis, how are the economies of Eastern Europe going to cope? And I was stumped by the question because the economies of Eastern Europe are now so different that I can't even answer the question. One of the things that happened after 1950, and particularly after Stalin died in 1953, was these countries began to differentiate. Since 1989, they've become so different. The differences between Poland and Albania might even be greater than the differences between Britain and Greece, in terms of the economy, in terms of the political system. And even to talk about this region, what we used to call Eastern Europe, as a single space with sharing a single identity, really no longer makes sense. They each have different relations with the EU. They have very different relations with Russia. Generally speaking, at the moment, Russia appears not to be preoccupied with trying to put pressure on Central Europe. It's sort of given that up to the EU, although there are still conflicts with what they call the near abroad, the Ukraine and Georgia. But these countries are as different from one another now as they were 100 years ago when they were part of very different empires. I see, Poland's best relationship in Europe right now is with Germany. Nobody could have imagined that 10 years ago. The Czechs and the Slovaks have become sort of busy traders. The Hungarians are in economic crisis, having been very badly ruled for the last 8 years. Estonia is a kind of free market haven on the Baltic where they have the flat tax and extremely sophisticated e-government. And the Balkans are the Balkans, so it's and they remain Balkanized. So it's no longer possible to talk about this region in a way that gives us a hint about how artificial that division of Europe that we got so used to really was. These are not places that are culturally similar or politically similar, and nowadays they're not economically similar either. I will stop there because Rudyard's wanted me to be extremely brief so that we could spend as much time possible answering questions. And I'm happy to talk about Russia. I'm happy to talk about Central Europe and indeed the rest of Europe. Thank you.
That was great. Just while we position the microphones for people to ask questions, and a quick one from me to you. A lot of people, I think, have been perplexed at Russia's intransigence around the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Do you think, what explains that, and how important your remarks about Russia's focus on the value of a barrel of oil in terms of the stability of their government, are they now, is this government, in terms of its foreign policy, now incentivized, in a sense, to seek instability in regions that ensure that price remains at a level where they can pay those pensioners and Putin can reaffirm his authority?
That is the conspiracy theory version of Russian foreign policy. I mean, that's the sometimes given as the explanation for why Russia supports Iran, because in the hopes that a small, short, and very destructive war would raise the oil prices and thus help the Russian budget recover. That's speculation. To me, the interesting thing about Syria, there are 2 points about it. One is that Russia's real interest in Syria is in a way ideological rather than practical. I mean, they don't have any real military interest in Syria. I mean, I guess they sell them some weapons, but they can probably sell more weapons to other people. And anyway, the Syrian government doesn't have any money anymore. What the Russians really disliked about Libya and what they're afraid of in Syria is the spectacle of society organizing itself to overthrow the dictatorship. The more times that happens, the worse it looks. The more they get nervous about their own, rightly or wrongly. I mean, there may not be a seriously well-organized opposition in Russia. I mean, there's something, but how effective it is and how deep it goes, we don't know. But nevertheless, the optics of Libya bothered them, and I suspect the optics of Syria will bother them too. If there's a war and if the opposition wins and there's a triumphant march into Damascus, and the dictator falls, that makes the Russians nervous because of what it looks like. There were similar rumblings and similar anxiety during the Arab Spring period there as well. So that's part of it. Maybe a little bit of conflict doesn't hurt the oil price. Their motive, the third motive, I should say, in their foreign policy is always to assert their. It's odd because I'll back up and I'll say, from the perspective of Washington, Russia is not very important. And in fact, from the perspective of the Obama administration, if they would just be quiet and stick to their own part of the world, nobody would be very worried about them. I'm not saying that's the correct policy, but that is the United States has, on the list of things to worry about, Russia's about number 17. There's Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, China, the U.S. economy, the Eurozone crisis, and somewhere down on that list is Russia, and it gets very little political attention and energy. And this is one of the things that seems to bother the Russians. I mean, they would like to be in the center of world events. And again, part of Putin's strategy for making himself legitimate is to be able to say, I've made Russia strong again, I've made Russia matter again. And that seems to be something he's willing to do, even if it's in a negative sense, that we've made Russia into a problem again. So I think all those factors are playing into the Russian behavior in Syria.
Great. Let's open it up to the floor. We've got microphones. We'll just look for hands, and we'll take some questions. So I think I see one. Jill's going to position herself right now.
Thank you for a wonderful talk tonight. I now understand a lot better why they've just banned Ripon in Russia. I was going to ask you that question, why have they done it, but you've already explained it. Your writing is so penetrating, and so it's just wonderful. And you can tell I'm a fan, and I even brought a book.
Oh, thank you. I think I write better than I talk, actually, so thank you very much.
No, you're very good. But as a journalist that has received the tremendous recognition that you've done, both in the outstanding literature and, of course, with the Pulitzer, with the assassination of Anna on Putin's birthday, you must, as a journalist who is getting so much exposure, be thinking a little bit about what that means to you personally. And you talked about how this selection process makes other people think. I'd be very interested in your personal reflection about that aspect of your writing.
I am not as brave as Anna Politkovskaya, and I'm not doing the kind of work she was doing. She was an investigative reporter who had contacts throughout Chechnya and throughout the Russian administration, and was involved in very kind of sort of deep work on what was really happening and in trying to piece together stories. I don't have that. I don't play that kind of role. I do go in and out of Russia, and I write what I write. But I don't think that the Russian government considers me a threat in the way someone like her was a threat. And I have, I'm not really positioned to do that kind of work. I'm not native. I'm not a native speaker. I speak Russian, but not like she does, and I wouldn't have her connections. So no, I'm not personally afraid at all. Maybe I think my mother is, but. She said to me when I started doing this new book, she said, "Oh, I'm just so relieved you won't have to go to Russia in order to write it." And I said, "Well, bad news, actually, there are some Russian archives to look at too." Although actually in the end I didn't need to very much. And I still do try to go back there. No, I'm not afraid, but I can see it in my Russian colleagues and friends. That when people, the risks have gone up. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but the numbers of journalists, Russia is actually one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. I think it's more dangerous than Iraq, if I remember reading the statistics correctly. Although it's not a war zone, people who do investigative reporting, particularly people who write about business, who write about the oligarchs, are shot from time to time. There was a famous American journalist, a Forbes editor, who was shot in Moscow, probably because he was finding out too much about who controls the money and how it's done. That's not what I do, and but I have only highest respect for people who do it, and they are all very brave.
Hi, you spoke about the power of radio earlier on in the last century, and the power of television under Putin, and then you've got Estonia sitting on the footstep of Russia, and there was no mention of the power of the internet, and this is an e-democracy, and why is it allowed to exist in the way that it is, and is it not a huge threat?
Well, Estonia is not in Russia. Last time I looked, it was still an independent country. So Estonia is, although it's interesting, Estonia is one of the countries that bothers the Russians the most, and there are periodic outbursts. There haven't been any recently, but there have been these kind of campaigns against Estonia, and there was at one point there was an attempt to take down some of the Estonian government internet websites that probably came from Russia. I mean, the Russians do find Estonia irritating. I mean, it's only 1 million people or something, and yet they seem to be doing so well. I mean, I almost find it irritating. I didn't mention the internet. I suppose I could have done. I think the jury is still out on the internet and on social media in general. When I look around the world and I see how it works and how it's used, the more I watch it, the more I think that technology is a neutral medium. I mean, technology is not morally good or morally bad. You can use Facebook to spread the word of freedom. You can also use Facebook to spread dictatorship. And I don't think we know yet whether Facebook and Twitter will be manipulated by these regimes, or whether it somehow is going to find its way. It's going to become a real method of communication. I mean, we have seen really what's the extraordinary lengths to which the Chinese regime have gone to control the internet. One doesn't really know how, well, certainly it's successful in that most people don't have free access. There are certain kinds of sites they can't see. There are certain kinds of articles they can't read. Clearly there's a small group of people who find ways around this, but I would say probably most people don't bother because you need to put a lot of effort into it. The Russians have been they're also interested in this kind of technology and this kind of control. they've been less good at doing it. It also matters less because I think the proportion of people, or the I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that they reckon that most people in Russia still don't have access to it, or in large numbers of people don't have access to it anyway. It's from their point of view the medium that still reaches most people, and the one that is the one that again, it's those peasants and workers. It's the masses who are most susceptible to our message, or so they've always thought. They still think it's television. I mean, they may well be proven wrong.
We're trying a little bit of an experiment tonight, Anne, which is we're capturing tonight's talk for the Huffington Post, which is going to air it internationally on a subsequent date. And there was a question from a Huffington Post reader in advance of your speech, which I promised to put to you, and it's from a Ryan Doherty, and it's basically about the Obama administration. And what happens now? Obama is reelected. Mitt Romney said Russia was what? America's #1 foreign policy enemy. Obama's taken a different line towards Russia. You've already referred to it tonight, but what is the Russian government's reaction to a reelected Obama? How do, if anything, do they change to anticipate his next 4 years?
Yes, I should note I was asked a lot recently at a meeting I was at about the statement of Romney's, and doesn't this prove that the Cold War is still alive in America? And I said, well, yes, Romney did say that, and he was so widely mocked for saying that he never said it again, which I thought was an indication that people don't think Russia's the #1 enemy, and it was a very odd thing to say, and it seemed out of character. You can make a case that we should be more worried about Russia than we are, but the idea that it poses an existential threat to us is harder to take. The Obama administration's attitude to Russia has been very hands-off. When Medvedev was still the president, there was a very clear policy, and the policy was to pretend that Medvedev was really the president. So Obama met a lot with him. There was a meeting between Putin and Obama right in the beginning that went disastrously wrong. Putin apparently lectured him for 45 minutes, and Obama said in the car on the way back, "I never want to see him again." I don't know whether that's true. Somebody told me. But so the idea was, let's pretend Medvedev is president and hope that things change for the better. That policy didn't work. There hasn't been a clear reaction yet to Obama's reelection. I will note that a few days after the campaign had ended, Putin did make a really extraordinary announcement, which was that he was expelling USAID from Russia. And USAID is, I suppose they do a few things that could be called democracy promotion or human rights work, but most of what USAID was doing was environmental studies, helping poor children, work with the handicapped. Almost all of it was pretty anodyne, and apolitical. But again, Putin does have an obsessive concern about the presence of foreigners in the country, foreign groups, foreign organizations. One thing I should have pointed out that I didn't was that he very recently, also in the last few weeks, there's a law coming into effect that says that any non-governmental organization in Russia that takes any money from outside the country of any kind, and that again it includes charities and people who deal with poverty, who takes any money from any kind, has to register as a foreign agent. And as I said this afternoon, the expression foreign agent sounds as sinister in Russian as it sounds in English. And people people think this could be step to a further kind of stigmatization and perhaps eventually a ban on anybody taking any money from anybody at all. So there is an attempt to stigmatize, to separate, to push away foreign influences of all kinds. We've also seen it in the business sector. Maybe there are people in the room who know this. Effectually pushing out BP, which made a big investment in Russia or tried to make a big investment in Russia, and further pressure on other kinds of foreign investments. Generally speaking, they don't want competition. They probably want Western technology, and there may be some ways in which they do deals to get it, but they are not interested in having foreigners earning a lot of money in Russia that they could earn themselves.
Nor is Gazprom too interested in fracking in Eastern Europe.
That's a separate issue. No, Gazprom is not interested in fracking in Eastern Europe, and there's some evidence that Gazprom has funded some of the environmental protests against fracking all over Europe, and Germany, most notably Germany, but at the European level and in Brussels. They are not interested in that because they're not only does their budget depend on natural gas and oil and gas, much of their political influence in Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe, comes from their control of the pipelines, their ability to set prices. Once that goes, and it would go if Poland does turn out to have accessible shale gas and appears to be willing to let people drill it, Poland or the Germans apparently have it too. That would be the end of a very important source of Russian influence and power. And so, no, they are not interested in that happening. And you can watch this space for, laws going through Europe to prevent fracking, and check out who the lobbying groups are behind them.
Perfect person to end with, Ted Morton. You're going to get the last question.
Thank you. I have a sort of an old Cold War question. Whatever happened to Radio Free Europe? Is there anything like that today, given what you said about Putin's obsession with dominating mass media? Is the United States or NATO doing anything to try to broadcast alternative sources of information into Russia?
There is still, Radio Free Europe still exists. Mostly it broadcasts nowadays in Farsi and Dari and Pashtun, but and it does actually very well in Afghanistan. Radio Liberty, which is the Russian language section of Radio Free Europe, is not in good shape. It's been effectively cut out of Russia. It's not allowed to broadcast. It was, in the past they broadcast on shortwave radio stations, and nobody listens to shortwave anymore. And so they had done, in the 90s, they did a number of deals with FM radio stations in Russia. And most of what Radio Liberty does is, it's very straight news. It's not anti-Putin propaganda. It's news. It's talk shows. It's just at a more neutral. Gives a more neutral cast to events than the Russian media does, and they have been now virtually banned from broadcasting in Russia. So they find it very difficult to get in. The only way they can do it is through the internet. They have a very big website. And there's a lot of turmoil and turbulence at Radio Liberty right now as people argue about the best way forward. It's got a new editor, and some people like her, and some people don't like her. I won't bore you with that piece of office politics. But the larger answer is that no, nobody has found a good way to, nobody in the government has found a good way to influence the way people think in Russia. Though the fact that Russia is now part of not only the global economy, but the global information economy, does hold out some hope. One of the things I found most fascinating about the recent case, this was, again, an interesting, the arrest of the three women, the Pussy Riot demonstrators, three women who sang an obscene song or critical song in a church and were arrested and given this extraordinarily harsh sentence of 2 years in a Siberian labor camp. One of the things, first of all, I found that interesting because, again, it indicates this real paranoia about those kinds of groups and about uncontrollable people. The other thing, though, is that almost the day after that happened, Madonna came to Moscow and performed at a concert and wrote, Pussy Riot on her back. And there was a huge numbers of pop stars from all over the world beaming support. Who knows whether this helps them or hurts them, but it indicated to me there's a whole, if Putin's aim is to control the politics and control the political discussion, but let people have, space in other areas. They can listen to whatever pop culture they want, and they can buy Western records, and they can have access to some foreign television. If that's his aim, then there is always the danger that can backfire. And what if the messages that you get from pop culture begin to be anti-regime? Then you're in trouble. So it's not a closed system, and it evolves all the time. I even suspect that in recent months, in the last year or so, it's grown rather harsher, and I think that may be because he's afraid. He's made more nervous by what would seem to you and me fairly ineffectual and insignificant people. He's become more nervous about keeping control. So,
Anna I'm just going to sneak one more question in under the wire because we're still just before 9 o'clock, and I call on the new CEO of Total, who's recently come from Russia to lead Total Canada. So I look forward to his question.
Good evening. Yes, I just spent 2 years in Moscow in the Stockman project as the project director. As you know, Stockman is one of the main projects of Gazprom. And I have a question about corruption. And in your view, do you think Medvedev and Putin are serious in their fight against corruption? Serious. Are they fighting seriously corruption? Or is it just to please the international opinion?
Now, in addition to Polish and Russian, you're fluent in French, so please feel free to respond in both of Canada's official languages, should you wish.
I'm not risking that in this one. No. The answer is no. They can't be serious because they are the main beneficiaries, or they are among the beneficiaries of corruption. Again, I have to be careful what I say. I can't prove anything. But as you know, many of the Russian companies are. Company directors are also politicians, and they're also part of the management of the companies and regulation of the companies. So there's enormous cross links and cross ownership between the natural resources businesses and the government. How you would that in itself is by definition a corrupt system. I mean that the people who are doing the regulating are also the owners or in some way the beneficiaries of the business. So it seems to me pretty fundamental. And they may well be able to crack down on some kinds of petty corruption lower down. We've seen this in other countries where certain relationships are allowed to exist at the top, but further down they may try and clean up, I don't know, so that you don't have to pay a bribe to get a telephone or whatever. I mean, it's probably not like that in Moscow anymore, but it used to be. But no, I don't see any sign yet that they're interested in a major reform that would de-link the government and industry in a way that we would recognize as transparent.
Well, Anne, one of the big objectives of this series is to bring to Calgary people with perspectives on the world, perspectives on issues and countries and problems that we are exposed to in our day-to-day lives, but often through, surrogates, the media, etc. So the opportunity to really have the opportunity to spend time with you tonight, to hear firsthand kind of your analysis of Eastern Europe, Russia, is a real privilege indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, on behalf of all of us, thank Anne Applebaum. Now, as I mentioned, Gulag, A History, one of my top 10 nonfiction books. This is Anne's latest book, The Iron Curtain. All of you will receive a complimentary copy tonight. Anne is functioning on some time zone. We're not sure which one. You can probably get a quick signature from her, but then I've promised to take you back to your hotel shortly. And just finally, to thank Jill Garcia, who's the new organizer of the Teatro series, has done a fabulous job. Her first innings out. Jill, on behalf of everybody, to you and Global Public Affairs, appreciate your efforts. We'll see you again for Tyler Cowen in the new year. Thanks, everybody. Good night.